Thank you for joining me for 10 minutes in the Word. In that lovely Old Testament book, the Song of Solomon, at one point the young woman who is courted by the king is asked about why she finds him so desirable. What is your beloved more than another beloved? She is asked. I wonder how you would answer that question about the Saviour. In this first main section of his sermon to the Hebrews, a section that runs through to the end of chapter 2, our preacher's theme is the superiority of Christ's person, specifically in comparison to the angels. And he quotes from 7 Old Testament scriptures, making 4 points of contrast, the third of which, in verses 7 to 12, we are looking at in this study. And the point here is that the angels are creatures, but Christ is the creator God. And in some ways the contrast in these verses is the starkest yet. As he says in verse 7, of the angels God says, but in 8 to 12, but of the Son he says. Now I think the best way to approach this contrast is to briefly consider the 3 Old Testament references that he quotes. So first of all we go to Psalm 104. And verse 4, he makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire. Now it's important to bear in mind that this is an example of parallelism, a key feature of Hebrew poetry. So the angels and ministers are different ways of speaking about the same thing, the angels. And the preacher is making the point that God makes of them and does with them whatever he wills. They exist to serve his purpose. Interestingly, the Jewish rabbis frequently used wind and fire as metaphors for that which is fleeting and temporary. And that may well have been another thought in our preacher's mind here. However, by the strongest of contrasts, let's move on to think about Christ by turning first to Psalm 45 that he quotes in verse 8 and 9. This psalm is what's known as a kingship psalm, and more specifically a love poem or even a wedding song. And interestingly, has some connections to the Song of Solomon that I spoke about a moment ago. And our preacher to the Hebrews quotes verses 6 and 7 of Psalm 45. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God your God has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. Here is one of surely the very clearest of all Old Testament statements about the deity of Christ. God addresses him as God and says his throne is an eternal and a never-ending one. Now, I know it's hard for us to get our small brains around the truth of this. God speaks to his Son and declares that he is God. But it does remind us, of course, of the mystery of the Trinity. God is one, yet 3, and all are equal in nature and in power. Notice too, please, that this Christ was not appointed to the throne, rather he was anointed for it, verse 9. And that's interesting because, of course, the very name or the title Christ literally means the anointed one. But also, looking at verse 9 in particular, see how this focus ties in with things we've looked at in previous studies. This anointed enthronement is the reward for Christ's faithful mediatorial work on earth, climaxing in the cross. In his life and supremely in his sacrificial death, Christ has, past tense, loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, his God, has anointed him. But although we can't dwell on this verse too long or go into too much detail, the point that our preacher wants to convey is unmistakable. As one writer puts it, the angels minister before the throne, but they don't sit on the throne. That is reserved for the Son who will reign eternally. So that brings us to our third Old Testament quote in this argument, and it's from Psalm 102, verses 25 to 27. Notice how our preacher almost merges these quotations seamlessly, continuing to address Christ directly. You, Lord, he says, you laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Like a robe, you'll roll them up. Like a garment, they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will have no end. Friends, those few verses are packed full of the most staggering truths about our Saviour. Just notice them. He is from eternity past because he was already there at the beginning of time. He is the one by whom and through whom everything was created. He is eternal, whereas everything that he has made will wear out. At the end of time, he will roll up his creation like a robe. He is the unchanging, the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is eternal and will have no end. Now, remembering the preacher's purpose in spelling out these great truths, none of these truths could ever be applied to any one of the angels. They are created by the Creator Christ, so they have a beginning, whereas he does not. They are servants of the throne, a point that will be emphasized in the last of these 4 arguments in this chapter. And they serve the one who occupies the throne for all eternity. Paul tells us in Romans that it is a mark of fallen and sinful humanity to turn away from the Creator and give the worship due to him to a creature, something that he has made. That also applies to Hebrew believers who are tempted in some way to turn their affections away from Christ, from the superior to the vastly inferior. Oh, how unworthy, how inadequate, how small are our thoughts about the one who, though for a little while was made lower than the angels, is now and for all eternity enthroned in heaven and crowned with glory and honor and power. Let's make sure we only and always worship him and not anything made by him.